I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at the fighting around Krnky on the left bank of the Dnipro River. We're live at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, where Volodymyr Zelensky is meeting European leaders, and we analyse and discuss the Russian so-called meat assaults.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Cleave stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 18th of July, 2 years and 150 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, foreign breaking news reporter Iona Cleave, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and foreign reporter Verity Bowman.
Hi David, hi team. Sorry if it's a bit echoey again like yesterday. I'm still at the Air and Space Power Conference, but hopefully it's okay. Ukraine last night launched a major aerial and naval drone attack on Russia's Black Sea bases, what are left of them. Residents in the port city of Sevastopol and Crimea reported loud explosions overnight. It's thought that Lake Danislav has been part of the attack. Now that's an area, it's in the northwest of Crimea, about 50 k's northwest of Sevastopol. Moscow's defense ministry said that they shot down 33 air drones and 10 maritime drones, unmanned boats, whatever we're calling those things, sea drones, that were headed for Crimea. Meanwhile, air raids also rang out across Novorossiysk. So Novorossiysk is that base about 100 k's further east in Russia. That's the port where Russia has moved its Black Sea fleet, or most of it moved from Crimea into the what they consider the comparatively safe area of Novorossiysk, although that has come under attack before. And as I say, air raid sirens were sounding earlier on today. The city's mayor there of Novorossiysk warned residents to stay away from the shoreline. There's no reports yet of the damage there. You'll remember earlier this month, Ukraine's naval drones did hit Novorossiysk. It's their largest port on the Black Sea, major transit hub. There were fires across the city on that attack, but we've not seen any footage from today. Separately, inside Ukraine and in the Donbass, Ukraine has confirmed its forces have withdrawn from the village of Urozhaine, that's in the east. They retook it last summer. There have been reports in the last few days that it had been taken, and Ukraine said that they were still fighting on. However, Lieutenant Colonel Nazar Voloshin said that the pullout was, quote, due to the fact that the enemy destroyed almost everything in the town. He said the decision has been made to preserve the lives and health of our personnel who were defending. Now, Russia attacked across the country last night with 16 Shahed drones, 2 Kh-59 and 69 cruise missiles, and 1 Kh-35 cruise missile. This comes from the Ukraine's Air Force. The 2 Kh-59 69 variant missiles and all the drones were reportedly downed by Ukrainian air defences over Dnipropetrovsk, Poltava, Zaporizhia, Kiev and Kharkiv oblasts, although there were deaths and injuries reported elsewhere in Sumy, Luhansk, Donetsk and Kherson oblasts. There were attacks but no casualties reported in Kiev, Mykolaiv and Poltava. Now, an interesting report here. We haven't talked much about the left bank of the Dnipro River, that push across that Ukraine managed in the last few weeks, actually, of last year. But a report suggests that Ukraine's forces have still been there, and that up to 788 troops reported missing in that area due to the heavy fighting over the last few months. Now, it's said that the period from October 23 to June this year, as an investigation outlet called Slidstvo.info, it's a group of independent investigative journalists in Ukraine, been looking at this and trying to work out from social media about the number of people that are missing there. They say that a number of soldiers engaged in heavy fighting close to the village of Krnky over that time period have gone missing, and the bitter fighting to hold on to that village has meant that, first of all, there's confusion and chaos, but it's thought that hundreds of Ukrainian families have lost loved ones there and are still waiting for official confirmation. They interviewed a number of people there. Anastasia Kostov, talking about her younger brother Oleg, said, "I'm looking. Some people say they saw his body. Others say there was shelling, but we can't find out what really happened there." Now, Ukraine's military says it's still fighting in the area. There had been reports it's pulled out completely, but it looks like it's out of the town of Krnky. They said many of the positions were, quote, completely destroyed. And Slitvo Info, the Ukrainian investigative outfit, say that fighting has now moved on to the islands between the two banks near the village of Krnky. It's an area covered in rivulets and small islands. It's very boggy and marshy. So still a presence there, but it sounds as if there's no longer fighting in what's left of Krnky itself. The Defence Forces of southern Ukraine said yesterday that they continue to carry out combat missions on the left bank of the Dnipro, in particular the area of the settlement of Krnky. They put this out on Facebook. They continued, however, it is true that most of the main positions of the Ukrainian troops in the village of Krnky, as a result of intense, combined and prolonged enemy fire, were completely destroyed. It added that the village itself had been almost completely destroyed, but that their forces would continue to be in designated positions and bridgeheads on the left bank of the Dnipro. So continue to watch that one with interest. Now, inside Russia again, and Russia's southern Belgorod region, that borders the Kharkiv region of Ukraine, that sort of northern area around there of northeast Ukraine, southern Russia. Belgorod region has shut down all children's nurseries located within 12-mile radius of the border due to dangers posed by shelling, they say. Regional official there, Anna Kudashova, said the measure that's going to affect about 50,000 people started yesterday will last the rest of this week, and then it's not clear if it's going to be extended any further. On Tuesday, Belgorod's regional governor said that 14 Russian border villages would be sealed off, given the ongoing intensity of Ukrainian cross-border attacks. President Zelensky has declared that his military has stopped Russia's major offensive in the area, so just over the border from Belgorod is that sort of Vovchansk lodgement that started last, when was it, about a couple of months ago now, May, but never really did anything. President Zelensky said that it's now over. He said that their Russian forces there have achieved nothing significant. He said the reality on the battlefield is more convincing than anything. We have stopped Russian advances on Kharkiv. He said Putin had sacrificed tens of thousands of his citizens, but has achieved nothing significant. And just finally for me, David, Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing Secretary General of NATO, he's been at this the meeting of the European political community that's taking place today in Blenheim Palace near Oxford. He's just said the time to stand for freedom and democracy is now, and the place is Ukraine. He talked about NATO allies stepping up support for Ukraine, gave a bit more detail about this command that's going to be set up to coordinate assistance, training and supplies to Ukraine. He said it's going to be operational from September, based out of Germany, 700 personnel under a 3-star commander. And President Zelensky is at the conference. He thanked the UK for being one step ahead and said this is the kind of resolve we need to stop Russian terror. But I won't eat any more of Joe's sandwiches from Blenheim Palace. I'm sure they're lovely without the crust on, and I will let him get a word in a bit later.
Thank you very much, Dom. Let's go to Blenheim Palace. Joe Barnes, you're on the ground. What's happening? What have you heard?
Hi, folks. Yeah, Blenheim Palace, here in Oxfordshire, the birthplace of Winston Churchill. And I'll give you a bit of a scene set. I'm sat in a field on a park bench, picnic bench, blue sun, parasol above my head, blue sky, smattering of clouds, some armed cops to my left, and Blenheim Palace, the turrets just popping up in front of me over the tree line. So we're miles away from the action, but we're got our eyes and ears on it. So President Zelensky has given an address at what was called the opening plenary session of this meeting, where Keir Starmer said, look, it's important to defend Ukraine and for us to all put our efforts into defending Ukraine. But I think Volodymyr Zelensky was the more important person here. And I'll break his speech down into a few chunks I found interesting. So on the actual war itself, he said, the more effective our air defense is, the more helpless Putin will be. The fewer restrictions we have on the use of effective weapons, the more Russia will seek peace. Military airfields from which Russian jets take off with bombs against our cities, our people, our children, and launch sites of Russian missiles, all these must be destroyed. So look, that's another plea, and it's not unusual for Zelensky when he's in the presence of world leaders to say, look, guys, we need more air defense. You've sent us a load of Patriots, a load of SAMP-Ts, a load of IRIS-Ts, all these different various systems, but we still need more. And then he is still on the crusade to basically find a way to get Western leaders to completely unrestrict, to end all limitations on their weapon systems. So you'll know that there are restrictions still on Storm Shadow, on the use of attack. There's still the Germans haven't offered to donate Taurus because they essentially are not allowed to strike into Russia, deep into Russia with these systems. They're very limited in what they can use, mostly artillery, and we believe HIMARS as well are allowed to fire over the border. Yeah, so interesting there. But then at the beginning of his speech, at the top of his speech, Zelensky gave a nice little nod to Winston Churchill. We're at the Blenheim Palace, the birthplace of Churchill, and he was like, this place is associated with Winston Churchill, and we remember Churchill with our special esteem, and we hold dear Churchill's jokes and remarks, though we probably would not want to be subjects of such biting humour. And then Zelensky went, look, we return to his speeches, we measure our own principles against his decisions, aspiring to similar heights. He's basically channeling the wartime rhetoric of Sir Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister during the Second World War, and taking it for his own. And then I think the other thing that I should mention is he took a dig. I would say I could normally use that sort of journalistic term, thinly veiled, but I would say it was actually quite a sharp barb instead, to keep the cliches coming, at Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who has been conducting his own, and I use a bunny ear quote, peace missions, visiting Moscow, Beijing, Trump at Mar-a-Lago, as well as Zelensky in Cleave. And this is what Zelensky had to say. He said, we have maintained unity in Europe and are acting together, which means that Putin has missed his primary target. He has failed to create division in Europe. The more decisive Europe is in preserving this unity, the longer lasting peace we will ensure. Putin cannot sustain relationships with truly strong leaders, and this is our advantage, but it remains an advantage only as long as we are united. He may try to approach you, to go to some of your partners individually, trying to tempt you or pressure you, to blackmail you, so that one of you betrays the rest, weakening our unity. Yes, everyone chooses for themselves how to act, of course, and what legacy to leave. But if someone in Europe tries to resolve issues behind others' backs, or even at the expense of someone else, if someone wants to take or make some trips to the capital of war to talk and perhaps promise something against our common interests, or at the expense of Ukraine or other countries, then why should we consider such a person? The EU and NATO can also address all their issues without this one individual. So that is a clear dig, without naming him, at Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who has been accused of going behind not Ukraine's back, but also the EU's back in conducting these talks about proposals of ceasefire with President Xi Jinping, with President Putin, with Donald Trump, the former president, without the consent or the backing of the Ukrainians or the European Union. We believe that my European sources would say that they believe Viktor Orban has told the people he's talking with that he is talking to them as an interlocutor of the EU. He is the rotating president of the EU at the moment. They say that is simply not the case. I'll stop there, folks. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, I'll listen in.
Just one from me, Joe, and maybe, of course, Dom, Verity and Iona have one as well. But Joe, what's your sense of the body language between the European leaders and Starmer and Zelensky? I know it's not potentially the most important point, but it's always interesting to know, has Zelensky come in here and arrived in good spirits? How is the Prime Minister reacting to him? What's your read of that?
Yeah, so body language is always interesting. And I've seen Zelensky at these international meetings throughout the war now. Honestly, I couldn't tell you how many times I've seen him in Brussels, Washington, Lithuania, Vilnius, and Ukraine itself, etc. And he's always the centre of attention when he comes to these things. And rightly, the European political community was literally set up in response to the invasion of Ukraine, and to look at how do we tackle the wider European issue without it being a European Union meeting. We look at our wider borders. So he is always the centre of attention. You can tell at moments in time. I remember he was coming out to various meetings when everyone was offering tanks, the Leopards, Challengers, etc., ahead of the counteroffensive, and he was walking with a spring in his step. That spring has slightly diminished, and he's slightly more serious now. But he's essentially looking to project that seriousness as a bit of gravitas to get leaders to give him more. So the somberness of his message is probably, it's more somber than it has been. He's talking, less jokes, but he still, interestingly, Starmer stood next to him when Zelensky was in his sort of most somber wording. Starmer put his hand on Zelensky's shoulder, who was sitting next to him, reassured him and said, "Look, we're here," which was interesting in itself. One thing was quite funny. The leaders, there's about 50 world leaders here, all from the European continent, and they all walked in, and Viktor Orban seemed to be very segregated from the rest of the group. It was him and a lone man whose whose face I couldn't see from the shot. But he was very segregated. Keir Starmer, I'd have quite expected him to be harder on Orban. Apparently they joked and spoke about the European Championship final last Sunday, because they were both in attendance. But it was done with smiles and it was convivial, where if you were to be, say, a European leader, probably Zelensky, you would be a lot more stern against him. But that's the scene set of how the body language is changing and evolving.
Thank you very much, Joe. We'll come back to you at the end, I think, for your final thoughts. It does sound like a fascinating day at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. Let's go to our foreign reporter, Iona Cleave. Iona, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. You've been running the live blog today. What are the other diplomatic and political updates you can bring us?
Hi, David. Yes, so this morning, EU chief Ursula von der Leyen had sharply rebuked Hungary's Viktor Orban's rogue diplomatic visit to meet Putin in Moscow as an appeasement mission. Von der Leyen is not attending the Blenheim summit as it coincides with an EU vote on her second term as its head. Instead, in a speech to the EU Parliament in a final pitch for her to secure backing, she turned her anger towards Orban, whose country currently holds the rotating EU presidency. In past weeks, he's blindsided fellow NATO and EU leaders with a sort of self-styled peace mission, as Joe was mentioning, to Moscow, Beijing and then Florida to meet Trump. Discussing his visit to Moscow, she said, "This so-called peace mission was nothing but an appeasement mission. This was a plain appeasement mission. Russia is banking on Europe and the West going soft, and some in Europe are playing along," she added, and then insisted that the EU will keep supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. Von der Leyen also seized the moment to state that Ukraine's joining of the EU will be a core priority as she achieves a second term. The future, she said, of Ukraine, Moldova and the Western Balkans lies within the EU, and that a larger union is a stronger union. And in other news, Zelensky faces a further crisis as Germany announced on Wednesday it will halve its military aid to Ukraine next year, despite the possibility that Republican candidate Donald Trump would return to the White House and curb support for Kyiv. German aid to Ukraine will be cut to €4 billion in 2025 from around €8 billion in 2024, according to a draft of the 2025 budget. Berlin said it hopes Kyiv will be able to meet the bulk of its military needs with the $50 billion in loans from the proceeds of foreign Russian assets agreed by the G7 last month. German Finance Minister Christian Lindner said Ukraine's financing is secured for the foreseeable future thanks to European instruments and the G7 loans. And today is also the day that espionage trial against Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is due to resume after it's moved forward by a month at the request of his lawyers. Mr. Gershkovich's trial began behind closed doors last month in Russia's Ural Mountains on espionage charges that he, his employer and Washington strongly deny. Russia has accused the 32-year-old American journalist of collecting secret information for the CIA about a tank factory. He was arrested in March 2023 while on a reporting trip and has since been held in a Moscow prison. The Wall Street Journal and US officials have both denounced the trial as a sham and accused Moscow of using Gershkovich as a political prisoner. And that's a summary of things today.
Thank you very much, Iona, for bringing us up to date on all of that. And I've just seen a news alert that Ursula von der Leyen has just been re-elected as the European Commission President. So thank you, Iona, for joining us. And we hope to hear from you again in the next few days and weeks. Let's go then to Verity Bowman. Verity, a couple of stories to talk through, I think, from you. You've been looking into reports of Russian so-called meat wave attacks. Talk us through this. What does this term mean and what have you found?
Hi, thanks for having me on today. So when we're talking about meat wave attacks, we're basically talking about what Ukrainian soldiers have been seeing on the front lines with Russian advances. So basically, Russia is throwing such a huge amount of men into the mix, and they're seemingly placing no value on their lives, and they're treating their soldiers as meat rather than human beings. And that's where the phrase is coming from. Basically, these Russians are coming in waves at Ukraine's defensive positions, sometimes dozens of times in a day. It looks like Russia is using a tried and tested method that we've spoken about many times, which is using its advantage of numbers. Moscow is able to keep throwing soldiers, even if they're poorly trained, straight onto the front lines at around the same rate that they are being killed or wounded. So when I did a little bit of an investigation into this, I found that Russia is actually so desperate for numbers that they're sending severely injured men into these assaults. We managed to track down some footage of these Russian soldiers and found quite a few videos. Some of them were standing on crutches, others of them had shrapnel wounds to their faces, and they were all saying that they are being forced to fight on despite these really serious injuries. And I think one quote from one of the videos really stuck out to me. And the soldier told the camera that the commander says, "Tomorrow we must go and storm this building again. But how can we do this if we are in pain, wounded, and simply don't have the strength?"
Verity, thank you so much for that. Tell us a little bit then about what Ukrainian soldiers are saying about this. You've been speaking to some of them. What are their views?
Yes, I really wanted to confirm these reports, see what else was out there, especially from the Ukrainian side. So I went and I contacted a group of soldiers that I've been in touch with on and off since the start of the war. And the thing that they were able to do was straight away confirm that this is what they're seeing on the front lines. They told me that it's normal practice to see injured men even staggering as when they're fighting. And perhaps something more shockingly that we have seen a little bit before is that two of them reported Ukrainian prisoners of war being sent before Russian troops almost as a human shield. So Hunter, which is his call sign name, he's a Ukrainian junior soldier, said that there are frequent cases of Russian soldiers simply being left to die. In the Donetsk region, a Russian soldier was captured by Ukraine, and he had his leg rotting from a shrapnel wound, but was still fighting on anyway. And it had been left so long and in such a serious condition that these Ukrainian medics were forced to amputate his leg. And the soldier actually told these medics at the time that this was better care than he had received from his own country. As I just said before about the Ukrainian prisoners of war, those reports were confirmed by two different soldiers who have been on the front lines for quite a while now. One of them was Yuri, who is a machine gunner, and he said it is tearing us apart from the inside.
And Verity, just before we move on, what's the intelligence backdrop to your story? What have you found?
Yeah, so I think it is really important to zoom out a little bit and get a bit of an idea of the figures behind these stories that we're seeing. And according to the Ministry of Defence, it's a very shocking figure. Russia has lost 70,000 personnel over the last 2 months. And again, this is an alarming rate that shows no sign of slowing. The latest death toll figures of these Russian soldiers equals about 1,000 soldiers a day. And we know that, again, as I said, it's only going to get worse because things seem to be escalating. So the MOD also said that this new approach has increased pressure on the front line, but that Ukrainian defences and a lack of Russian training is actually reducing Russia's ability to exploit this and take advantage of the tactic of numbers.
Thank you so much, Verity. Turning to Ukraine's recruitment drive, it's something we've spoken about on the podcast many times. You've found in some recent reporting that tensions are rising. You've been looking at two separate stories, the shooting dead of a deserter and a bombing of a recruitment centre. Can you talk through where this happened and what happened?
Yeah, so as we know, Ukraine is starting to struggle a little bit in terms of numbers simply because Russia is able to throw so many men at the front line. So they have started this new recruitment drive, and it is causing an awful lot of tension in Ukraine. Earlier this week, as you said, we had two reports emerge that showed the recruitment push might not be going as well as they'd hoped. According to officials, a Ukrainian army deserter was killed, and he was one of 4 servicemen that are now being held because they tried to cross the Moldovan border on foot. Border guards say as well that dozens of individuals have been killed this year alone while attempting to cross the Tisa River, which runs across Ukraine's western border. They said even in recent months, they've apprehended dozens of people attempting to smuggle themselves out of the country. Meanwhile, the other story that you just mentioned is police are hunting an attacker who hurled a grenade at a military recruitment office in the town of Butsk in Lviv. Luckily, no one was injured in this incident, but the building was pretty severely damaged. We've heard reports about these kind of attacks in Russia before because there is a lot of resentment about conscription and about recruitment drives. But so far, over the last 2 years, these have been very rare in Ukraine. So it really does indicate the sort of changing mood in the country when it comes to fighting, and perhaps that a lot of people are quite battle weary. Recruitment officers are also reporting that they've received abuse from the public. And yeah, as we said earlier, just to sum up, Ukraine really is in just a difficult situation owing to the sheer volume of personnel that Russia is able to deploy to the front line.
Verity, just to end, are you hearing anything from your contacts about this recruitment drive and its reception?
Yeah, so I've been reaching out to quite a few people, both who are on active duty and those who aren't. And I've been in touch with a man named Vladislav, who is from the eastern Severodonetsk region. Since the very early days of the war, he's helped me on quite a few different investigations over the last 2 years. So far, he hasn't been fighting and he hadn't been conscripted because he's got some really serious medical conditions. But the last time I got in touch with him on a different story, he straight away brought up that he is going to be sent for training quite soon. He actually suffers from a cavernous angioma of the brain, and that causes seizures, stroke symptoms, hemorrhages, headaches, and it can be quite serious if it doesn't get good surgery. He told me that he often loses consciousness, and I think something, having known him for quite long, that really has stuck with me is that he finished his message with, "I will either be killed or I will become disabled."
Verity, thank you so much for your reporting and for joining us today. Dom, can I come back to you? You mentioned earlier that you'll have some updates from us from the conference you're attending. Dom, what are you hearing?
Yeah, thanks, David. Just a couple of bits and bobs. It's been been very wordy, as you'd expect. Although a lot of those words are really quite self-aware, I would say. From the Brits, I'd say there was a lot of references to how hollow our forces have become and how brittle, if you can have both of those things. There's not a huge amount of numbers of platforms in the Royal Air Force at the moment. A lot of conversation here about actually we should get away from thinking about platforms. We need to think about the metal bits and bobs that fly around the sky just being a wrapper for the software inside. And it's the software that's the important bit, because it doesn't matter what the actual platform is, as long as all the software can talk to each other, then you've got a better capability. That's fine. That looks great on some of the slides that we were showing with lots of zigzaggy lines all over the place. Very difficult to do. And the US, the head of the US Air Force, was very honest about how he arrived here. He said it was in the old days, in the Cold War, we knew what the enemy was, and you built your military force, and Air Force in particular in this context, accordingly. And he said then everything changed when at the end of the Cold War, and he said he refers to it as the Last Supper. In 1993, he sat down with a load of industry representatives, and they were all saying, "Oh, this is the end." People were saying, "Oh, it's the end of history," and all that kind of jazz. And without a clearly defined enemy, it was very difficult to see where the future contracts were going to come from. We then got all bent out of shape over the sort of counterinsurgency years, and he says the platforms that were designed for the Cold War were, with a little bit of tinkering and tweaking and blobbing stuff together, worked, but it was a come as you are party. It was take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and blob it together. And of course, we had the time to do it because we had the huge home bases, and we actually even had the very large air bases in and around the areas we were working in, where, well, let's take Taliban in Afghanistan, they couldn't really impact. They did actually get onto Bastion once and killed a number of people and destroyed some aircraft, but generally the air bases were safe. He said, well, that's all gone now. You can't, in this new world, if it's Cold War 2.0, whatever you want to call it, but now that the threat has revealed itself and what we need to build against for the future, it's not a come as you are party. You need to have deeply ingrained culture, doctrine. You need to train as you fight. You need to train with allies. You need to work with allies, be fully interoperable. That software I was talking about whizzing all over the place, not just in your own force, but across allies and partners as well. So he said it's a really difficult problem that we've yet to grapple with. A couple of quotes here. So the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton here in the UK, he was talking about deterrence, saying it has to be active, not passive. He said hard power really does matter, which is, we often hear cyber this, cyber that, space and all the rest of it, but hard power is getting a look in again. He says there's much that we can and will learn from Ukraine, but we also have to be careful that we don't exaggerate the lessons to be learned. And then he said this rather startling statement. He said, you might remember shortly after the war in Ukraine started, he means the full-scale invasion, that he said the Bayraktar TB2 was king, but it didn't take long for Russia to develop counters to it. He said, I'm told by one of my fellow chiefs that the TB2 actually only flew 42 missions. I don't know if that's true, but a bit like something Boris Johnson said, it's a fact too good to check, which was quite an amusing line in itself. Paints a picture of Bayraktar, but also a bit of a dig at Boris Johnson, which is always rather amusing from a serving chief of the air staff. He just finished, he said, drones are going to form a fundamental part of our future force structure, and that will solve some of our problems around mass, survivability and lethality, but it doesn't mean we should throw away all of our modern equipment and imagine we're going to replace it all with cheap drones. And just finishing off that point about have we just got a small number of exquisite forces, as they're known? We just don't have the mass to put up with anything like the attrition you'll see in a major peer-on-peer war like we're seeing in Ukraine. Air Marshal Johnny Stringer, the Deputy Commander of NATO headquarters, brother of a friend of the pod, he said, have we developed air show air forces? Aircraft that look good pulling 9G in front of us and on the static displays, but there's a lot more, many other areas that make up a capability. He said, you've got to get all the parts right. It costs more to build a second-rate air force than a first-rate one because you get smashed up and have to replace it all. A bit of healthy sort of realism, I would say, whether or not anything comes of it. Obviously, this is taking place in the context of a strategic defence review here in the UK, with the new government having just been voted in. Whether this healthy realism drags through or continues through that, or if it goes back to what the military normally does, which is very platform-centric, buying stuff and then bolting other bits and pieces onto it, has yet to be seen. But quite encouraging self-reflection, I would say, here in the Air and Space Power Conference, David.
Thank you, Dom, Joe, Iona and Verity. Coming up, we hear Verity and Dom's final thoughts. Thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Verity Bowman, you're still with us. What have you been reflecting on?
I think my biggest reflection of this is that we are going to have to keep looking out for these little reports of tension in Ukraine about the recruitment drive, because I do think they're going to build up into quite a bigger picture of resentment that we should really be tracking that. I also think that we should be looking out for reports of more Russians being sent to the front lines when they're injured. I think that is going to continue to be a big problem. But I will keep investigating, keep contacting people, and I will let you know when I have more updates on that.
Thank you very much, Verity. I know that Iona's had to go back to the live blog and Joe at Blenheim Palace has had to go back to the conference. Dom, would you like to give us your very final thoughts to end today's episode?
Today's episode, I was responding to Tim in Canberra. Thanks, Tim, for getting in touch. He was asking a question about how come so many of the GPS-enabled munitions that West has supplied to Ukraine, like Excalibur and HIMARS and what have you, there's reports that a number of them have been jammed by Russia. And GPS is quite an old technology, so we should have been aware of that and able to defend against it. I said I was then going to get the chance, no pun intended, get the chance to speak to General Chance Saltzman, great name, who's the head of the US Space Force an hour later. Tim, I did go and speak to General Chance, and I asked him that question directly, and I'll read you his answer, which is fair enough. He said, I don't have anything specific for you on that. I just don't have access to the details to be able to explain that. It doesn't surprise me, though, that in the crucible of conflict, both sides learn very rapidly. Nothing's more clarifying than combat feedback. It's devastating, and it requires immediate evaluation of what can and can't be done. Over time, tactics and counter-tactics ebb and flow continuously. However, he did then say, what I'm focused on when I look at those observations from conflict is, do we have the kind of organisation that can rapidly learn lessons, adapt new tactics and respond to what an adversary is doing or not doing? Do we have the right modelling and simulation? How fast can we learn the lessons, train the operators with new tactics, new techniques, and maybe change the software algorithms rapidly? What does that take contractually? So he's highlighting the problems for a military not in direct contact with the enemy, about how to get around that problem. He was essentially, I had to chat with a few people later. Essentially, I think the answer is that GPS can be jammed, even with the best protections in the world. If you shout hard enough at it, you will break through. So yes, Russia is able to use their electronic warfare systems in certain areas to swamp the electromagnetic spectrum and deny those munitions the use of that technology. They can't do that everywhere all the time, and they themselves put up a big EW signature when they do it, so are targetable. But I thought I'd bring you General Chance Saltzman's answer. He's the head of the US Space Force. He's basically saying that yes, you can get around it. The question for the likes of him and people in this country, Paul Tedman, for example, Army Air Corps, mate of mine, former Army Air Corps, who's now heading up Britain's Space Command. How do you actually do this sort of thing in peacetime when you've got to put in line, you've got to fight for money and policy and all the rest of it? It's one thing to do it, having learnt lessons from, as he says, the crucible of conflict, but to do it in peacetime and on an enduring setting is quite another thing. Again, a lesson for the Strategic Defence Review. But Tim, thanks so much for your question. We do endeavour to ask the right questions, your questions, of the right people if we don't know ourselves. And so that's not a full and comprehensive answer, and it's probably not very satisfactory. I'm sorry, Tim, but thank you for getting in touch. And we do try and get hold of the right people to ask these things of.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.